Have you ever wondered why Pakistan seems to be stuck in this endless cycle of economic crisis, always bouncing from one bailout to the next? It's a really complex question. Today, we're going to try and unravel it, not with our own theories, but by diving into the analysis of someone who's seen it all from the inside, Mohammed Yaqub, a former governor of Pakistan's central bank. So, let's get into his blueprint for a way out.
Right off the bat, this quote from the author really sets the tone. What he's saying is, look, this isn't some historical review of a problem that's over. For Pakistan, the crisis is always happening. It's a chronic illness, not a temporary fever. And that's a really important way to look at it, because it means we have to search for deep, systemic issues, not just isolated mistakes from the past.
All right, so let's start by looking at this frustratingly repetitive pattern. According to this analysis, it doesn't really matter who's in charge. Government after government has followed a very similar and, unfortunately, very predictable script. When you look at the timeline, you start to see this crazy, familiar pattern emerge. The author points out how each government blames the previous one, but then goes on to make the same kinds of short-term fixes. You had the 90s, which he calls a lost decade. Then in the early 2000s, the big idea was to juice the economy with cheap money, basically encouraging everyone to spend. Well, that just ignited massive inflation. And the result? By the late 2000s, the country was in an even worse spot because none of the real underlying problems had ever been touched.
And this right here is the central question of this whole explainer. It's one thing to see what is happening over and over again, but the real mystery is why. Why is Pakistan stuck in what feels like an economic Groundhog Day? The author digs really deep to get to the root cause, and the answer is probably not what you'd expect.
To get to that why, we first need to follow the money. And the author argues that the biggest, most glaring problem, the one that really poisons everything else, is the country's completely broken public finances.
He does not pull any punches here. He calls the mismanagement of the national budget, and this is a direct quote, the mother of all economic ills. Think about that. Not just one of the problems, but the source, the parent of all the other issues like inflation, debt, and weak growth. So just how bad are we talking? Well, take a look at these numbers from the 2009 fiscal year. They show where the tax money was actually going. A huge slice goes to just paying interest on debt. Another giant piece goes to defense. You add just those two things up, and you get a number that is just mind-boggling.
97.4%. Seriously, let that sink in for a moment. For every 100 rupees the government collected in taxes, more than 97 of them were already spent. Gone. Before they could even think about paying for things like schools, hospitals, roads, all the stuff you need to actually run a country, it is a built-in recipe for failure.
And believe it or not, it gets even worse. The author points out that the official numbers were bad enough, but they were often hiding the full picture with clever accounting. The true cost was even higher because of massive losses from state-owned companies that were conveniently kept off the books. The real story was much, much scarier than what was being reported. To try and plug these massive holes, the government would often resort to selling off national assets. The author uses this absolutely brilliant analogy to explain just how dangerous that is. He says it's like a family selling off its silverware just to pay the monthly grocery bill. Sure, it works for a little while, but pretty soon you're out of silver and you still haven't fixed your spending problem. So this all begs a pretty obvious question, right? If the government was spending this recklessly, where on earth was the institution that was supposed to be the grown-up in the room? Where was the financial watchdog? I mean, a government can't just print money endlessly without someone blowing the whistle. That is literally the job of a country's central bank. So naturally, the analysis turns its focus to the State Bank of Pakistan, the SBP, to figure out what part it played in all of this. And on paper, the SBP had all the tools it needed. Back in the 90s, laws were passed that gave it real power. It was supposed to be independent. It was supposed to set hard limits on how much the government could borrow. And, this is the most important part, it was supposed to enforce those limits.
So what went wrong? Well, here is the kicker. The author's assessment is just brutal. He says the SBP had the legal power to stop the government's out-of-control borrowing, but it just didn't. It abdicated its responsibility. The problem wasn't a lack of rules, it was a total lack of courage to enforce them. Okay, so we've seen the messed up budget. We've seen the watchdog that didn't bark. But the author says, hold on, even those are just symptoms. To really get it, we have to go one level deeper, down to the absolute core of the entire issue.
And there it is, the ultimate diagnosis. It all boils down to two words: poor governance. All the other technical problems we've talked about, the deficits, the inflation, the debt, they're just the inevitable outcome of a system that's fundamentally broken at its core. Now, poor governance can feel like a vague term, right? So what does he actually mean? He's talking about the absolute bedrock of a functioning country, things like the rule of law, so everyone is held accountable. Strong institutions, so the financial referee can actually do its job without fear. And a real, long-term economic plan, so the country isn't just lurching from one crisis to the next. According to him, these things were simply missing.
But look, this analysis isn't just about pointing out all the problems. It's also about offering a solution. So now let's turn to the comprehensive blueprint for reform that the author actually lays out.
First up, tackling that mother of all ills, the fiscal reforms. Step 1 is just basic honesty. Stop the accounting games and show the real numbers. From there, it's about fairness and discipline. Expand the tax system so everyone pays their fair share, and get serious about cutting wasteful spending. Basically, start living within your means.
And on the other side of the coin, you have the monetary reforms. Remember that missing watchdog? Well, it's time for it to finally do its job. The central bank has to use its legal power to put a stop to the government's unlimited borrowing and stop printing money like there's no tomorrow. The goal is to create a stable environment that actually encourages people to save. So, a clear, logical, technical blueprint for fixing Pakistan's economy is right there. The author lays it all out. But, and this is the huge but that the whole analysis leads to, the technical fixes were never really the issue. The final, lingering question is the one he leaves us with. Is the political will and the courage there to build the foundation of good governance? Because without that foundation, no blueprint, no matter how brilliant, will ever work.